I declare open this public hearing on the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its inquiry into the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Australia and the United Arab Emirates and the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Australia for the promotion and protection of investments. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we all meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. In accordance with the Committee's resolution of 4th August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website.
Your sound.
My apologies, everybody. What a rookie mistake. Sorry about that. I'll start again. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its inquiry into the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Australia and the United Arab Emirates and the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Australia on the promotion and protection of investments. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. In accordance with the Committee's resolution on 4th August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will also be published on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media the need for fair and accurate reporting on the proceedings of the Committee. I will now call our first witnesses for our first panel for this inquiry and our hearing today. I welcome representatives of the Australian Meat Industry Council, the Australian Livestock Exporters Council and the Australian Dairy Industry to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the Committee? And if I can start with the Australian Meat Industry Council.
Thank you. I'm Timothy Ryan, Acting CEO of the Australian Meat Industry Council.
Thank you. The Australian Live Exporters Council.
Scott Compo-Harms, Deputy CEO of Australian Livestock Exporters Council.
Thank you. And the Australian Dairy Industry Council.
It's John Williams, Deputy President, Australian Dairy Industry Council and President of Australian Dairy Products Federation.
Great, thank you. And we've got two other witnesses that are here with us.
Yeah, that's Nathan Pope from Australian Dairy Farmers, part of the Australian Dairy Industry Council.
And Carl Ellis from Dairy Australia.
Great, wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today. Although the Committee does not require...
Sorry, excuse me, Chair. Sorry to butt in. Our CEO, Mark Harvey-Sutton, I think he might be having trouble with his audio, so he's also present from the Australian Livestock Exporters Council.
Great.
I've worked it out, Chair. My sincere apologies for that.
You don't need to apologise. I started the hearing on mute as well, so you can tell it's the first hearing back for the year. So all good. I think we are all declared, accounted and recorded in Hansard. Although the Committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that may be taken. I'd like to invite each of your organisations to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion and questions. And I note that we've got two other committee members that are present today. We've got the member for Spence, and we've also got a Senator for Queensland, Senator Kavanagh, as well as myself and the Deputy Chair, just to give committee members an idea of who's joined us today. Looking for volunteers to go first on an opening statement.
Happy to go first.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. The Australian dairy industry welcomes the opportunity to speak at this inquiry. Dairy is Australia's third largest rural industry with a farm gate value of $6.1 billion. Australia is a major player in global dairy exports, exporting to over 100 markets and ranking fifth in terms of world dairy trade. In 2023-24, Australia exported approximately 32% of its milk production, with exports valued at $3.6 billion. Exports are critical to the economic sustainability of the industry. Domestic production in Australia exceeds the volume required for domestic consumption, with surplus product destined for export markets. The Australian dairy industry has benefited from and actively leverages Australia's 18 FDAs to access global markets. The strong collaborative relationship between the industry and the government has been pivotal in ensuring the sector's unique needs are represented during trade negotiations. The Australian dairy industry has welcomed the positive outcomes of the Australia-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, concluded in September 2024. The Australia-UAE CEPA is a welcome opportunity for the Australian dairy industry, with the removal of 5% tariffs on Australian dairy exports, improving cost competitiveness in the UAE, a market worth $27 million in 2023-24. However, FDAs are not a standalone solution and do not automatically provide Australian exporters with an advantage. Ever since the conclusion of the Australia-UAE CEPA, New Zealand has secured its own FTA with the UAE, but most importantly, along with an additional FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, illustrating how rapidly competitive advantage can be diminished in the global market. This has put us immediately behind our major global competitor in this market before the ink is even dry on this particular FTA. The GCC is an emerging market for Australian dairy exports, representing substantial opportunities for growth and diversification. Both the Saudi Arabian and Kuwait market are significantly larger than that of the UAE. In 2023-24, the volume of dairy exports to the Gulf Cooperation Council market as a whole was 29,610 tonnes, valued at over $148 million. So we urge the Australian government to pursue FTA negotiations with the GCC. Enhanced market access and reduced trade barriers would allow Australian dairy producers to capitalise on the region's growing demand, ensuring the industry remains competitive and economically sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dairy Australia. We'll now go to the Australian Meat Industry Council.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the benefits of the Australia-UAE CEPA today and the importance of free and open trade more broadly for our industry. The Australian Meat Industry Council represents the post-farm gate meat supply chain. Our members include Australian processors, exporters, wholesalers, small goods manufacturers and independent retail butchers. Our members directly employ tens of thousands of people, and the red meat sector as a whole directly supports almost 200,000 jobs and generates the same again from indirect employment. Our members play a critical role in supporting the economy in rural and regional Australia, where the local processor is often the primary employer in a country town. Australia has a long-standing trade relationship with the UAE and the Middle East more broadly. The region represents a young and fast-growing population looking for high-quality produce. As a major exporter of high-quality, halal-certified red meat, Australia has naturally grown to be the preferred origin of choice for many UAE consumers. The UAE is a large and established market for sheep meat, and there's further growth opportunities for building premium beef products. Last year, Australia exported almost 15,000 tonnes of beef, worth nearly $240 million, and over 35,000 tonnes of sheep meat, worth $320 million, to the UAE. About two-thirds of this trade from Australia to the UAE is chilled, with the balance being frozen product. The Australia-UAE CEPA will remove the 5% tariff on Australian frozen red meat and offal exports, removing an unnecessary cost of doing business in the market. This agreement will secure tariff-free exports for all Australian red meat and meat products to the UAE and complements further gains we've seen on the non-tariff barrier front, notably extended shelf life requirements for chilled Australian meat. Importantly, the Australia-UAE CEPA provides a framework for further liberalisation in the region. Industry strongly encourages the Australian Government to engage the wider GCC in a regional trade agreement, and notes one has recently been secured by our New Zealand competitors. Applying the benefits we have secured under the Australia-UAE CEPA to neighbouring markets, which buy a greater proportion of frozen meat, would have even greater impact and benefit to the Australian meat supply chain. Thanks again for the opportunity to discuss the benefits of this agreement with you.
Thank you very much. And now from Australian Live Exporters Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the committee's flexibility to dial in. I apologise for my surroundings. Due to school holidays, I'm working from home and my office is in my garage. So, but please excuse me while I read here. The Australian Livestock Exporters Council appreciates the opportunity to appear before this very important committee. We are supportive of free trade, and indeed we are supportive of the ratification of this agreement, as it will deliver significant economic benefit to Australian agriculture. The UAE is an important market for our industry and has been a pillar of live sheep exports for decades. Industry in the UAE has invested significantly in improving animal welfare in this market with the support of Australian industry. Indeed, animal welfare is a central pillar of our access to markets such as the UAE. I emphasise this so as not to give the incorrect impression when we raise the point that we have concerns about the inclusion of an animal welfare chapter to this agreement. We are not concerned with the chapter's content. We are concerned about the process and the manner in which it was included. This chapter was included at the urging of Australian-based animal activists, and its inclusion serves domestic political purposes rather than bettering the agreement in any substantive way. We believe this sets a deeply concerning precedent for the negotiation of future free trade agreements, which should be focused on deriving maximum economic value for Australia rather than a vehicle or mouthpiece for domestic political agendas. And we would welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you. I've got some questions, but I might just see if my committee members, if they wished to open the batting. Deputy Chair?
Chair, we've lost your sound again. Chair, we can't hear you.
What about now? No?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Fantastic, because these are good questions. Thank you, Chair. Was ALEC or any other agricultural bodies consulted on the inclusion of the animal welfare text in the negotiation stage?
I'll ask my colleague Scott Gompe-Harms to answer this one. Thanks, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. No, we were not directly consulted on the inclusion of these provisions in the text.
In the reference to, or do you believe, and this is open for anyone, in the reference to animal welfare in the agreement, do you find it necessary? And I know that you touched on it just before, Carl, but is there any unintended consequences with this part of the agreement?
We don't see necessarily any unintended consequences for this specific agreement because, well, first of all, our supply chains do invest in animal welfare, and it's absolutely a focus of our industry in these markets. It's what happens next and what is the future of future negotiations. And I know this hearing is focused on this specific agreement, but it's the precedent that this sets that I think is actually quite concerning. The government has indicated that this could be a template for future negotiations with other Gulf states as part of the Gulf Cooperative Agreement. And I think certainly I was only there in the region at the end of last year, Deputy Chair, and their concern about policies such as the live sheep ban is causing considerable concern. So I think at the end of the day, these agreements should be focused on actually deriving a return for the economy and for agriculture in particular, from our perspective. And we are concerned about, well, what does the inclusion or pushing these domestic agendas, what impact does that have on our future negotiation capacity?
Yeah, and I've one more.
Sorry, Deputy Chair, can I just elaborate on a point that Mr. Harvey Sutton made there? Trading relationship between two countries or countries within regions, they are much bigger than just an FTA. So there are a whole range of other negotiations that go into setting up a trading relationship and making it commercially viable. One of those negotiations revolves around technical market access. And these technical negotiations around things like health protocols, disease status of animals and that sort of thing, food safety, all of those conditions are obviously conducted by officials at a very technical level. Nevertheless, these things can be significant barriers to trade if there's misunderstandings between countries or they don't agree on definitions and those sorts of things. Dare I say it, that some countries may seek to use these things deliberately as a way to limit or hamper product going into their market. The critical thing around these technical negotiations, though, is that anything you put on the table in another sphere, and so in this case, like an FTA negotiation, if Australia is putting something on the table, then other countries can be very transactional in that regard. So they can actually seek to open up other aspects of the trading relationship and those negotiations, which can in turn lead to the introduction of other difficulties or barriers that hamper the commercial viability of the trade taking place.
Thank you for that. And just so, you know, this is your world, not mine, so I kind of need you to dumb it down for me. Just a politician. So in very basic communication, do you think or are you concerned about animal activists having too much influence over over trade policy agenda?
In simple terms, Deputy Chair, yes, absolutely. And I think an example we can point to is the Australian Alliance for Animals was openly saying it was in Brussels seeking to try and influence the EU position during our FTA negotiations. I think that is a great concern for future negotiations.
Yeah, I might just jump in there. Australian Dairy Farmers supports that position as well too.
Thank you, Chair. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. We might go to the member for Spence now. Matt, do you have any questions for our witnesses?
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested to get from the Australian Meat Industry Council just what you see as the most significant parts of this CEPA agreement with Australia, and then just to get a bit of an understanding of how valuable the meat export industry is between the two partners in this agreement.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The biggest immediate impact is going to be the removal on a 5% tariff on a key part of the trade. It's not going to be an absolute game changer, but 5% over hundreds of millions of dollars worth of trade adds up to quite a lot of value that we can recoup. It'll have some benefit in terms of promoting further trade, but it's really removing a cost of doing business. We've got a very long-standing business relationship with many customers in the UAE. This will benefit both sides with the removal of that cost. I think the important thing that we'd like to stress is the precedent that this agreement sets for the broader GCC. Engagement over probably a decade has been on and off with the GCC and looking at establishing a wider trade agreement with the group. I think now that we've secured this agreement with the UAE, that sets a really good template for how we could apply those same outcomes across the region more broadly, and particularly now that the New Zealanders have similar access with an agreement with the GCC, we'd strongly encourage the Australian government to pursue a similar outcome.
Is there anything else that we should be mindful of before ratification of this agreement, though?
Within the agreement, not from our perspective. There's always work to do on new and emerging non-tariff barriers. We work very closely with government to address those as they arise. Some of them can be supported with a free trade agreement, but a lot of them require ongoing technical work as they emerge. So probably outside of the agreement is an ongoing focus from government to work through those issues as they arise, because at the end of the day, they have a far greater impact than the degree of tariffs that we're seeing eliminated under this agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan. In the interest of sharing the call, Chair, I'll leave my questions there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. I've got Senator for South Australia, Senator Smith, seeking the call. But before I go to the Senator, the member for Nichols, were you also seeking the call?
No.
Okay,
no
worries.
I'll leave my time to Senator Canavan. I think he's got some questions.
Okay, all right. We'll go to Senator Canavan first, and then we'll go to Senator Smith.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Can I just ask a little bit more about this animal welfare chapter? What is it meant to do? I know you're not necessarily the advocates for it, but are there some benefits from it? I mean, what will it impose animal welfare requirements or conditions on the UAE or on ourselves? What does it intend to do?
Thank you, Senator. From what we can read from the chapter itself, it doesn't actually impose any substantive requirements around the agreement, which on the one hand we see as important because it does not hamper the negotiation. However, what it does do is point to perhaps a virtue signalling within how we intend to do future negotiations, and that's what we are most concerned about. As I said in my opening statement, we are very supportive of this agreement being ratified. We think it's important, and we support both our dairy and meat industry colleagues in the benefits that it derives, but it is principally the precedent that we are so alarmed about.
Senator, I'm just at a point there, sorry. So the first that we became aware of this, there was an industry briefing that was given after the negotiations had concluded. So there was an announcement by the government that the agreement had been reached. And I think it took, most people in the room by surprise a little bit. Certainly in the consultation processes, industry wasn't asked whether this was a feature they wanted to see in the agreement. It may have come from another industry group. They may have made a suggestion in a submission or something like that. But as far as we're aware, it didn't come from the industry side. So in that meeting, we took the opportunity to question the negotiating team from DFAT and ask them about what was the purpose or the intent of the inclusion of the chapter. I specifically asked a question about, did you have any concerns about animal welfare in the UAE? And the answer that we received was no. And so it raises the perplexing question as to why this chapter would seek to be included if we don't have any concerns, and rightly so. I don't think we do have any concerns about animal welfare practices in the UAE. And it's my understanding that this did not come from the UAE side, so they were not concerned about Australian animal welfare practices either. So it raises the question, what's the purpose of it? We don't understand. And as I said, anytime you put something on the table in one of these negotiations, it can spill over into other very delicately poised technical negotiations which hamper commercial access.
I mean, you've raised that point that it may give rise to countries using this chapter in a spurious fashion to restrict trade, presumably for other reasons. Are there particular provisions in this chapter which allow a country to say, look, we don't believe your animal welfare outcomes are up to scratch, we're halting trade, and we have the right to do so under this agreement, or put tariffs or quotas or whatever it is, and we believe we have the right to do so under this agreement?
Can I jump in? Thanks. So our read of the text is that it's a broad information sharing initiative, which is effectively non-binding on either party, but there's a commitment to share information. From our perspective, if that's where this ends, I think AMIC has no issue with the text in the agreement, but we share, I suppose, caution with ALEC and our dairy counterparts that where this goes in the future could become a concerning space for us, particularly if it becomes binding and prescriptive. The way we run livestock in Australia is very different to the environment and systems you've got in Europe, in the US and the Middle East. So we need to be mindful that the way we regulate welfare in Australia is suitable for Australia, and it's not a overseas country applying their own domestic environment to the Australian context, because that's when it becomes very unworkable, and it would become quite constrictive for our businesses.
Okay, you mentioned.
Sorry, Senator. Just to go back to that point again that Mr. Harvey Sutton raised earlier about the presence of activists presenting to members of the European Parliament, for example, around the time when our EU negotiations were happening. They were actively, I suppose, promoting to members of the European Parliament that Australia's welfare standards were low. And they were trying to leverage the fact that our animal welfare standards are different from the EU because our production systems are different. And so, taking things out of context, of course, you can come up with saying that Australia does not have a law that does X, Y, Z, so therefore their standards are lower than ours. That is not the case at all. And it's just, I think that's the precedent that we're worried about it can set in other agreements.
Yeah, and we'd agree there in terms of the nuances that need to be looked at when negotiating these. I think the fact that it wasn't actually brought forward to industry prior to actually being introduced was a major concern. And as my colleagues have pointed out, there are particulars, including technical details, that we need to actually have properly assessed and involved in any of these negotiations.
Are you just on mute, Senator?
Thank you. Sorry, we've all got to do it once. So there has been impact analysis done on this agreement. Did it cover the inclusion of this chapter? Was there an analysis of its impact?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is anyone that, okay, not that you're aware of. And we can follow that up later. And does the government make public who it's consulted with? That is, do you know whether or not the government did consult with animal welfare groups or animal activist groups about this or these provisions in the text?
No, Senator.
Okay. And look, finally, for me, just on a separate topic briefly, Chair, if I have time, I noticed that the agreement also includes First Nations. I'm not sure if it's a separate chapter or section for First Nations people. I know your industry, especially the live industry, would employ a lot of Indigenous Australians. Were you consulted about those provisions of the text?
Not to my knowledge, Senator.
No, right. Senator, not to my knowledge.
Okay, no one. All right. A bit strange that given the agricultural sector's strong employment of Indigenous Australians. All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Great. Thank you, Senator. So I've got a few questions just to finish out your contribution to our hearing today. If I can just go to our representative from the Australian Meat Industry Council. You mentioned in your opening statement about the high quality opportunities that will exist under this agreement and sort of the export, particularly in relation to chilled meat. Can you just expand on that for us and what opportunities where we might currently be at and what opportunities we could have in that space?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Firstly, I suppose the tariff advantage, which is the kind of clearest benefit, is applied to frozen. We've already got a 0% tariff on chilled. There is some premium frozen product, particularly in certain segments, but a lot of the premium end of the market's on the chilled side. Where we do see some benefit is in the trade facilitation aspects to the agreement. We do a lot of chilled via sea freight and air freight. When you're doing a perishable product, every kind of hour helps in terms of that time to market. So we've got great shelf life. We can stand behind with our product, but anything to get it into the market more quickly is an advantage. So there's some benefits in the trade facilitation aspect for that premium end of the market. That market is already strong and growing, and I expect this agreement will reinforce that growth that's already there.
And I guess just one for all of you, just individually, when these free trade agreements come up, and we've had quite a number of them negotiated more recently, a couple of first-time agreements or refresh agreements, and the ag sector has done very well in a lot, and with the previous government and with this government around quotas and access. And when we have these discussions, we do talk about the benefits to signing on to the agreement internationally. Does your industry have any assessment on the impact it will have domestically? So if we increase our exports of meat to this through this agreement, what impact will it have on the domestic sale market? Is there a direct impact? So I guess start with the Australian Meat Industry Council.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and our membership includes businesses that do purely service the domestic market as well. We've got a large number of retail butchers in our membership. So the FTA itself is not going to pull product from the domestic market. It's a 5% cost reduction. It will ease doing business and take cost out of the supply chain, but it's not going to trigger a wave of exports going into the market. It'll save costs for everyone along the supply chain as the primary benefit, and give us the ability to probably get product into market that little bit quicker as well. We aren't expecting a wholesale shift in, I suppose, product going offshore from the domestic market.
And is that because the product going tends to be, say, in relation to sheep, it's the offal? Is it that we just don't have a domestic market for it?
When you process an animal, I suppose you're really deconstructing an animal into 100 different products. Australians love certain products. They love mince, they love rump steak, they love chops, but that leaves a lot of the carcass unutilised or not preferenced by the Australian consumer. And they're often the products, along with offals, that we send into the export market. The UAE takes a wide variety of cuts from kind of cheaper end all the way up to premium products. For those exporting it, they're finding that balance of what the Australian consumer wants and what they're willing to pay, and then exports the balance of the animal.
And do you feel that your members, the industry, is ready to scale up for any growth opportunities that happen? So do our abattoirs have enough workers? Is there that ability to be able to tap into that opportunity?
Balancing the labour force and a fairly seasonal supply base with the Australian cycle of droughts and wet periods is a major challenge for our processing members. It's part of the day-to-day challenge you've got to navigate. Across the board, we've continue to see major labour shortages and labour constraints, and a lot of costs that comes a lot with bringing people in and finding labour. So our industry is highly reliant now on migrant worker schemes to supplement the domestic workforce. We'll always try and secure an Australian for an Australian role, but the last few years with the unemployment rate where it is, we just simply can't access those people in Australia. So we are utilising some of those migrant worker schemes, such as PALM, very highly.
Can I ask Live Export Council, how's the Australian stock going? We've got lots of great quotas now and lots of agreements, lots of access, but do we have the herd to satisfy those quotas?
It's a bit of a difficult one for us to answer, Chair, and I'll reference your previous question as well. Given the government does have a policy to ban live sheep exports, the domestic benefits are a little bit hard to quantify. And indeed, if you look at Western Australia, figures coming out of Western Australia recently, they indicate that the sheep flock there has declined by 25% in the past 12 months. And if you look at a market like UAE, if we do get out of sheep there are no cattle exports going there. So there is no opportunity for alternative live exports there, which will impact demand. But I do want to make, I guess, one very important point. I was in Dubai last year, and it is a fantastic market. It is a growing global city. But when you stand there and you're presented as a consumer with meat products, there are actually three categories. You have your imported frozen meat, you have your imported chilled meat, and you have your fresh category. Now, your fresh category is the category that comes from locally slaughtered livestock. A large proportion of that would be Australian livestock, but from other countries as well. And the reason that consumer segment exists, it's for cultural purposes and religious purposes. So there is opportunity for growth in all three of those categories. But the chilled market, the frozen market will not overtake that fresh category. That will simply be replaced by livestock from other markets if Australia's not there. Thank you.
So just a follow-up question. So I'm interested in if you've got any insight into the impact on the domestic supermarket prices. So if we increase exports through this agreement, what will be the impact on the pensioner just wanting to buy steak or lamb at the supermarket? Is there any direct link?
Chair, we wouldn't have figures on that, but I think what concerns us, if you look at those figures about the flock declining in Western Australia, what is the sustainability of that flock into the future? Do we actually have the potential for less sheep to be available for processing? And if that is the outcome, which we do strongly think it will be, well then the realistic proposition is domestically your prices will probably increase. But I don't represent the retailers, the meat retailers, Chair. I represent the exporters, so it's probably not my place to say that.
Yeah. So I guess the final follow-up before I go to dairy. So if the clock's declining, whether it be drought or other, and exports increase, will there be a hit to the domestic supermarket prices?
Chair, yeah, go, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. I might just add a few thoughts. The single biggest driver of livestock and then subsequently meat in Australia is the season. We have a very volatile climate. It's outside everyone's control. Everyone along the supply chain tries to deal with that as best they can and manage that volatility and risk. Month to month, year to year, that's the biggest driver. Agreements like this one on their own will be a minor influence compared to those big macro factors that we'll have to deal with. The type of product that will benefit from this, primarily being frozen meat, a lot of that is often mutton, so older animal sheep. You don't find that on the supermarket shelf in Australia. The frozen beef that we send is also more often more commodity product. So again, I'm not expecting that to be diverted from, say, a retail supermarket or a retail butcher away from them onto the export market too. So there are different products that are benefiting, and I don't think we're going to see a big diversion from those domestic retail channels.
Great, thank you so much for that clarification. If I can jump to Dairy Australia, is there any foreseen impact on the Australian domestic supply and domestic market with this agreement increasing exports or potentially increasing exports?
Thank you, Chair. Yep. Let's go back to the heart of what we've achieved here, and this is a reduction of a 5% tariff. So this is a reduction of a cost of doing business into a certain market. What we've effectively done is just keep a pace with our major competitor in regards to the cost of doing business there. And that's what we face, whether it be domestic or in the global market, is our cost competitiveness with our major competitors. And in Australia's case, they're right on our doorstep. It's New Zealand. So we will now go into that market with basically a level playing field with them. We never really gained anything out of it. When this relays back into the domestic market, is all about the cost competitiveness of our industry in Australia, which has been under a lot of constraints, a lot of challenges. We've lost 13 dairy processors in the last 2 years, and most of that is around being cost competitive, not only in the global markets, but close to home in the domestic market as well. And if you start to lose your viability in a domestic market, then there's less offering to our consumers in the Australian market. So that's probably the concern, is that we have to continue to stay viable in these export markets whenever we've got an opportunity, and particularly if our competitors are getting an edge over us, but from a cost point of view. So we've kept a pace in this market, but as I said, we've missed out on the GCC, so we're no longer cost competitive against our major competitor. And here, as we face increasing costs on a regular basis, it's concerning around the viability of our industry and what that flow-through effect has on consumers in the Australian market.
John, I might I'll just add in terms of the context as well about the UAE. For the Australian dairy industry, about 90% of our exports go north into Asia. So Southeast Asia, Indonesia, also up into China, Japan, Korea. So it's sort of the effect of a 5% reduction in cost to the UAE. While it's an important market, it isn't nearly as significant as some of those large Asian markets. So any sort of influence is going to be quite marginal.
Do you think it has the opportunity to grow? Like, we are talking about a big population, and some of the earlier evidence was suggesting that this is sort of the foothold into the Middle East markets.
Definitely an opportunity to grow, and I think if coupled with further enhancement of the trade with the GCC, it's definitely a very attractive market, particularly as a whole region, and the UAE being a hub for re-export is important. So there is key opportunity, but in terms of relative size, it's not nearly as significant as those large Asian markets for the dairy industry.
What's predominantly the product that will go in? Are we looking at baby formula, or is it a certain type of, what kind of dairy products are you expecting to do well with this increased access?
Yeah, so primarily right now the biggest value earners for dairy is whole milk powder and cheese, and that aligns with their two of our main key exports we ship globally. They also have high shelf life. One of the big constraints of getting stuff to the UAE is shipping. It is a more expensive place to ship product to than the Southeast Asia or China. So that's where this 5% benefit does help us be a bit more cost competitive versus product coming from Europe, or particularly New Zealand.
I think I'll just add to that. I think what also a benefit is smaller dairy manufacturers who are quite innovative and have done well in the domestic market in regards to new innovation, new packaging, particularly in categories like cheese and yogurt. They're finding that the market here in some ways mirrors the demands or what the consumers are looking for around innovation and packaging and so on, particularly in those UAE markets, which are sophisticated dairy market. So we've seen quite a few small companies who have established themselves well with a brand, being able to transfer that over into some of those sophisticated markets like Southeast Asia, but also the UAE.
Great. My final question to all of you is just in terms of timing. How important is it to your industry that we finalise this process and ratify this agreement as soon as practical, as soon as possible?
Yeah, I think we pointed that out. I mean, New Zealand's hot on our heels with all of this stuff, so we can't let them get a step in front of us on anything.
Yep. So that's for dairy. What about for Live Export Council?
Chair, it would be beneficial for all parties that this is ratified as soon as possible, and we'd like to think that we have the opportunity to provide them with all the products that they're seeking. Thank you.
Yep. And the Australian Meat Industry Council?
We share a similar sentiment. I think for any trade agreement that we've negotiated, the sooner the better. Our industry thrives on free and open trade, and at the moment there's a lot of risk out there on the global market. So any additional agreements that we can put in place will give our exporters that greater assurance that they need.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your attendance here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to any transcript errors. Please send any responses to questions taken on notice during this hearing to the Secretariat by close of business 7th of February 2025. Good luck with the rest of school holidays, and thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, we are now waiting for our they've joined us. Our next witness and the next hearing that we have, this is panel number 2, we have the Australian Industry Group who have joined us. So I now welcome representatives of the Australian Industry Group to give evidence today. And for the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Louise McGrath. I'm Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group, and I'm joined with my colleague.
Thank you, Louise. Good afternoon, Chair. I'm Nin Nueu. I'm the Economic Policy Analyst from the Australian Industry Group. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, the Joint Standing Committee on Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, CEPA, between Australia and the United Arab Emirates. The Australian Industry Group, our group, is a peak national employer organisation representing traditional, innovative and emerging industry sectors. We've been acting on behalf of businesses across Australia for over 150 years. The recent signing of the CEPA with the UAE, Australia's largest trading partner in the Middle East, is set to bring substantial benefits to both countries. The agreement is expected to facilitate smoother and more cost-effective trade processes. We particularly appreciate the implementation of a country of origin scheme that aligns with other free trade agreements. This, along with digital signatures, will reduce complexity and administrative burdens. The agreement's digital advancements set a precedent, encouraging regional adoption and enhancing trade efficiency and economic collaboration. CEPA removes tariffs on more than 90% of Australian exports, either immediately or in the near future. This is particularly advantageous for industries such as mining, with the alumina exports alone valued at $1 billion in 2023. This tariff elimination positions CEPA as the most liberalising free trade agreement the UAE has implemented. Another significant aspect of CEPA is aligning regulatory standards between markets, which simplifies trade and reduces operational hurdles for businesses. By addressing technical trade barriers, CEPA encourages Australian businesses seeking global expansion. It also streamlines customs procedures, cutting down on the time and costs of cross-border trade. The agreement supports mutual recognition of conformity assessments, allowing Australian products to enter the UAE market without additional testing, saving time and expense. CEPA fosters regulatory cooperation in financial services, telecommunications and e-commerce, preventing further business hurdles from regulatory changes. This FTA is Australia's first in the Middle East and is expected to boost confidence among many companies to explore this market. This agreement opens new avenues for economic collaboration and signals optimism in trade relations, and we endorse this agreement.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that opening statement. I'm just going to just put the call out to my colleagues who might be here to see if they've got any questions. It looks like Deputy Chair, did you have a question?
No, I was going to say I took up a lot of time last time, Chair. I'm happy to share.
Right. No worries. Member for Spence?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm happy to kick off some questioning. And thank you for providing your submission. I am interested to just get a bit of an expansion on your views around the country of origin scheme. I know that there's a perceived improvement in streamlining trade transactions. Can you just expand on what the benefits are for Australian businesses looking to enter into the export into the UAE?
Certainly. So country of origin schemes and certification applies to most free trade agreements because, it's a negotiation between two different markets. We need to make sure that it's our own businesses that get the advantage, not just anyone else. And so, unfortunately, that does mean that within a free trade agreement, it's not free from paperwork. And so there is this additional proof that's required. Now, UAE and other Middle Eastern countries already require certificates of origin, often issued by the Arab Chamber, but they require what they call wet signatures, wet seals, which means that the exporter has to go physically into an office, get these things stamped, and then they physically have to send the documents. The progress with this COO scheme is that it does accept digital signatures. So think about what that would mean for an Australian exporter. Just the hours of, physically coming into an office to emailing. So within the Australian Industry Group, we issue certificates of origin. We guarantee that within 2 hours of receiving, or business hours of receiving the request, the company will receive the certificate back, and often it's much closer than that. It also means that if certificates are lost, or misplaced, or if there's an error, it's much easier to fix. What some research has shown is that for every saving you can make on this trade facilitation, it's 10 times that of the savings you get from a tariff reduction. Because at least with tariffs, you could say, well, a government is getting some income, which they might do some good with. But when it comes down to paperwork, no one makes any money out of it, but it just costs everyone money.
No, thank you. I just was thinking of it from a horticulturalist perspective. Look, the certificate of origin, the efficiency that's going to be picked up there, will that actually open up opportunity for those time-sensitive commodities that are looking to be exported? Does that increase their potential share of market in the UAE for our, like just down the road in my electorate, for my undercover croppers growing tomatoes, capsicums, cucumbers, etc.?
Absolutely. In fact, it was the horticultural sector that drove me initially to push for these electronic certificates of origin, originally under the TAFTA agreement, which I think is 2005, so it's coming up to 20 years. So under the TAFTA agreement, which is Thailand, we had unprecedented access. However, as you correctly identified, sometimes, with the feedback we got from horticultural exporters, they could be driving to the airport and their trader would say, look, I've just suddenly got a deal for some, apples. Can you chuck a few boxes onto the plane while you're there? So but they couldn't because they didn't have a certificate of origin, and it would take sort of 24 hours for them to go into the office and get it stamped, etc., etc. So by having it online, they can, do it from the car, and they've got it certified and it's ready to go.
And just
because it
my
has to have
last
the shipping details in it. That's why it's linked to the airplane. Yeah.
So this is my last question, Chair, but in the previous panel we heard it calls for an expansion to the Gulf Cooperation Council agreement, looking at the broader region. And I'm just interested to get your thoughts on, are there barriers beyond the UAE potentially with the electronic country of origin scheme? Is there considerations that we'd have to take if we were looking to expand to a bigger part of the region?
Well, I think to ask the region to do that, they might want something else, so they might want an actual free trade agreement. That's usually off the back of that. I think there's huge potential if we could get it across the GCC, because really that region has such opportunity, there's such growth potential, but it's that trade facilitation that's really holding it back, I think, for a lot of Australian exporters.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Senator Canavan, do you have any questions?
No, I'm okay, thanks, Chair, here, but I'll come back if I do.
Yeah. And the member for Nichols.
No, I'm okay, thanks, Chair.
Great. Thank you. I do have a few questions. In the analysis that was done, there was, and in your submission, it highlighted the real benefits of signing on to this agreement for Australian industry. I was just wondering, can you foresee any losers with this agreement? We've seen with previous agreements, it's sort of one industry pegged against each other, and we've seen decline in some industries as a result of previous free trade agreements. But can you see any Australian industry potentially losing out? If so, kind of by how much or what could go? And then I guess what could be done to help mitigate any potential losses?
Well, I think the nature of the UAE market, I mean, they're not significant producers of products that would, undercut Australian manufacturing. So I can't see that. Given that the broad range, I mean, it's such a comprehensive agreement, everyone essentially gets a prize. I mean, everyone has an opportunity if they want to take it to enter the market. I can imagine there would be some pockets, not that they would be diminished by this agreement, but perhaps don't have the same level of opportunity, and they would be culturally sensitive products that perhaps the UAE might not want to purchase regardless of what an FTA says.
Okay, thanks for that. And what would be the risk if this agreement isn't entered into as soon as practically possible by the government and by, pending ratification of this agreement through the Parliament?
So I think we're entering into a period of quite unstable trade relations, and Australia is only going to be a loser in that. It doesn't matter what our relationships are with individuals. So we need as many countries as possible, particularly middle power countries such as Australia and UAE, to stand up for trade. And I think if we were to walk away from this agreement, the ramifications would be broader than just losing out on this particular agreement. It would say to the world that Australia no longer is a supporter of free trade.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to check with my colleagues to see if they had any further questions.
Yeah, Chair, I'll just ask one question then if there's no others. Just following on from the former witnesses, there were some complaints from the agricultural sector that they hadn't been consulted on some of the specific chapters of the agreement. Did you have any concerns about the consultation in this case, or how do you rate how it went to finalise this agreement?
Well, we don't have such sensitive areas, as I said, with UAE. So we were really keen to make sure that there was a decent digital chapter and the regulatory side, because then we can, once we've got those good foundations in, then we can make the agreement work for us. But you may be aware that in previous inquiries related to the usage of FTAs, we've advocated for a trusted advisor scheme similar to what America has. I mean, we signed the TPP as it was, now CPTPP, not having seen any text, whereas there were something like over 60 Americans who had detailed knowledge of the text, representing industry, separate to the negotiators, because they have this trusted advisor scheme. And I think if Australia, I mean, we've now got, I think almost 90% of our trade is covered by an FTA, so I'm not sure what the scope is for the future, but I think any deal now, we're really on the margins. We need to make sure we have engagement. Therefore, this trusted advisor scheme must be taken forward, which I think came out of the recommendations in the FTA usage.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And that brings us to the end of our questions today. So thank you for your attendance here. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to any transcript errors. Please send your response to these questions taken on notice during the hearing to the Secretariat by close of business 7th of February 2025. We might take a short pause with our hearing today whilst the Secretariat can see if our next panel are able to come on and start panel 3 session a bit earlier. So we'll pause broadcasting and pause this. Now I'd like to welcome representatives of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network and the Australian Nurses and Midwifery Federation to give evidence. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee? And we'll start with the Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Thank you, Chair. It's Liam O'Brien, Assistant Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and I'm with Claire.
Claire Middlemass, Senior International Officer, Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Thank you. And next, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. You're just on mute there. Okay, we'll jump to the Australian Nurses and Midwifery Federation first.
Thank you. It's Mark Dunstan for the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation.
Great. And I'll just go back and check with the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. Can you hear us? Patricia? Yeah, we've just got you on mute there, Patricia.
Thank you. It's Mark Dunstan for the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation.
Great. And I'll just go back and check with the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Patricia?
I'm Patricia Ranald.
We've just got you on mute there, Patricia. No. For some reason, Patricia, there's a bit of a, you're replaying what we've already done. So I might just get, if someone can talk to you about that. Can you just mute for a moment, Patricia? Let's go back and check with the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network.
Yeah,
Hear us.
yes, I'm getting an echo, so I'll go away and come back.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just work with Patricia on resolving that IT issue and proceed with the witnesses that we do have. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It's the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions that may be taken on notice. Would either of you like to make an opening statement before we proceed to members' questions? And can we start with the ACTU?
Thank you, Chair. We would like to make an opening statement.
Proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to make a submission and appear before the committee today. The ACTU is the peak body for Australian unions, and we're joined here today by one of our affiliates, the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. We're also pleased to be on this panel with the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, of which the ACTU is a member. The Australian union movement has made our position clear from the outset. We strongly oppose the Australian government pursuing a bilateral trade agreement with the United Arab Emirates due to their consistent and serious violations of fundamental labour rights. We call on this committee to oppose the ratification of both the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and the Agreement on the Promotion and Protection of Investments. The UAE would be the most repressive country any Australian government has ever entered into a bilateral trade agreement with. In the UAE, trade unions, political organisations and political parties are illegal. Workers are prohibited from collectively organising, bargaining or striking. Migrant workers, who make up 80% of the population and 90% of the UAE's workforce, are effectively modern-day slaves under the kafala system. In addition to widespread abuses of workers' rights, there is widespread abuse of human rights, including systemic discrimination against women in the UAE, and the criminalisation of homosexuality and transgender expression, and the criminalisation of political dissent. The Australian union movement is deeply concerned that ratifying a trade agreement with the UAE sends the signal of Australia legitimising and incentivising continued violation of labour and human rights. It is our view it is inconsistent that a Labor government, which has introduced industrial relations reforms, to better protect the rights of Australian workers, reforms to the migration system to protect migrant workers, and reforms to combat modern slavery throughout our supply chains would contemplate closer economic ties with a country that does not even enable independent trade unions to operate. Indeed, just a few months ago, your committee held an inquiry into whether Australia should ratify ILO Conventions 187 and 191, relating to the ILO recently elevating a safe and healthy working environment to a fundamental principle and right at work. This was something that was well received and recommended by this committee. The subsequent ratification of these conventions meant that Australia recently became among the first countries in the world and the first in our region to have ratified all fundamental ILO conventions. This is something we should be very proud of as a country and clearly sets out our values. So we see it as a serious inconsistency that this committee is now having to review whether we do a deal with a regime such as the UAE, which is in violation of fundamental workers' rights. Whilst we appreciate the Australian government has pursued labour provisions in this agreement, it should be noted that these are unenforceable. Unions have been clear throughout, however, that even the most carefully worded labour chapter will not resolve the core problem here. There can be no sound basis to build a dialogue on labour issues when dealing with an authoritarian regime that does not respect fundamental labour rights or recognise independent trade unions. The Australian Union Movement strongly believes that the government should not give preferential market access to countries with poor labour rights practices. Given the UAE's notorious record on human rights, including workers' rights, we call on the Australian government not to ratify this agreement unless and until the UAE takes concrete steps to safeguard workers' rights. At a minimum, those steps must include respecting freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, allowing independent unions to operate and abolishing the kafala system and providing remedy to workers who have suffered modern slavery. We urge the committee to oppose these agreements and thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. The nurses, the Australian Midwifery and Nursing and Midwifery Association, did you also wish to make an opening remark?
Only to say that we endorse everything that the ACTU has put forward. Similar to what the ACTU has said, this is while we may have some concerns on the fringes around some elements of the agreement, including around trading services and potential foreign investment into health and aged care services that might be actioned as a second-tier effect of this agreement, our fundamental point that we wanted to put here today is the same moral one that's been expressed helpfully by the ACTU. For the ANMF and for our members, we hold to core values that include the universal provision of healthcare without discrimination, the universal right to freedom of association and the freedom to organise, and the rights of women and LGBTQ people to enjoy the full breadth of freedoms and human rights that they are entitled to under international law. There is no moral case for giving a trade agreement with investment and trade priority to a state which doesn't adhere to those basic principles and basic values which are shared by Australians and by nurses and midwives around the country. And on that basis, we also say that this is an agreement that the government should not pursue and enter into.
Thank
We
you.
also want to thank the committee. We want to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Patricia, how'd we go?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect. So can you state your name for Hansard and the capacity in which you appear, and then continue on with an opening statement if you have one.
Thank you. My name's Dr. Patricia Ranald. I'm the convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. And I do have an opening statement. So the Australian Fair Trade, I'd like to thank you first for having the opportunity to appear today. The Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, or AFTINET, is a national network of about 60 community organisations supporting fair regulation of trade consistent with human rights, labour rights and environmental sustainability. Because of the very poor record of the UAE violations of human rights and labour rights, We did make submissions to the government advocating that negotiations for a preferential agreement shouldn't commence without demonstrated improvements in those rights, which would also be consistent with the government's policy to include enforceable labour rights and environmental standards in trade agreements. As the ACTU has mentioned, despite some recent changes to labour laws, the UAE hasn't ratified basic conventions on freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, and 90% of its workforce consists of temporary migrant workers with no effective workplace rights, which has been defined as modern slavery. There's also specific discrimination against women and criminalisation of homosexuality. The UAE also has a poor record in relation to implementation of the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions. So I just want to emphasise that in addition to the union movement, there's widespread concern in the community which have been expressed by national membership-based organisations about these issues. After discussion with a number of these member organisations of AFTINET, 9 national organisations concerned with human rights, labour rights and modern slavery also wrote to the Trade Minister opposing the negotiations. In addition, to AFTINET and the ACTU, these organisations were Amnesty International Australia, the Uniting Church, the Catholic Office of Justice, Ecology and Peace, ActionAid, the Family Planning Alliance and the Australian Conservation Foundation. And just to clarify, Amnesty, the Uniting Church and the Catholic Office all have practical experience in dealing with human rights violations and modern slavery, and ActionAid and the Family Planning Alliance focus on women's rights and gender rights. The Australian Conservation Foundation was represented at the UN climate change meeting held in Dubai, where there was a lot of controversy about the UAE's chairing of that meeting because of its role in the fossil fuel industry. Now, all of these issues were detailed in that letter and submission to the inquiry. And I just want to say briefly that although there are short chapters in the agreement dealing with labour rights, women's rights, Indigenous rights and environmental standards, which do refer to some UN and ILO convention, the language is not binding and does not commit the parties to implement them. And nor does the state-to-state disputes process in the agreement apply to those chapters. So in trade agreements, if you're actually going to do something, the language you use is shall, whereas all of the language in these chapters is like recognise, promote, encourage. There's hardly any shall language. And the exemption from the disputes process means that there's no way of enforcing even these weak commitments. So there's no obligation on either party to take any action to implement these chapters. And this is a clear contrast to the situation which occurs if one of the parties violates a tariff or other commitment in the other chapters of the agreement, which are all shall commitments. So if this happens, if there's a violation of one of these other chapters, the other party is able to take this issue to a disputes process. So it means that there's no obligation to implement the rights and standards referred to in these chapters. So I'll finish there and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening statement as well. We'll now proceed to questions from committee members. And I just wanted to see, first of all, if the Deputy Chair or Senator Canavan had any questions. Or the member for Nichols?
Yeah, I suppose the first broad-ranging question, and thank you for appearing, the caveats that all of you have seemed to put on trade with other countries seem to be vast, and you would no doubt be aware that those barriers to trade with other countries affect workers in our own country, in Australia, particularly in my electorate that's predominantly agricultural and food manufacturing, whether they're members of unions or not. But how far does it? I'll just invite you to talk about how far does it go if the United States withdraws from the Paris agreements, as I heard somebody mention then. Does that mean that we should withdraw from a trade agreement with the United States? And a lot of the things that you've said in relation to the UAE could relate to China. I mean, just some broad comments on how far this goes in imposing Australian laws and norms on the countries that we decide to trade with. It's a pretty open one.
Happy to take this first. So firstly, thank you for the question. So I think the first thing we would say is that preferential trade agreements should be on the basis of shared values, human rights, labour rights as a starting point. We obviously trade with a lot of countries around the world, but this is a question about who do we provide preferential market access to. In the case of the UAE, we are talking about a country that has some of the worst violations of labour rights. This is a country that the ACTU is a member of the International Trade Union Confederation, ranks at the lowest level when it comes to a global index on human rights and labour rights. So, notwithstanding the points that you make, we believe that this is reaching a new low when it comes to offering preferential market access to countries that are very different in terms of our values. And those values are not just Australian values, these are human rights. These are rights recognised in international forums. They are fundamental principles and rights at work, a declaration agreed to by all nations of the world. So we do think there is a distinction between the examples that you're drawing, and we think this is a reason why Australia should not be entering into, not be signalling that we should be having closer economic ties with a country like the UAE. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. The member for Spence, did you have any questions for us?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I guess in little bit in light of, in the same vein as the member for Nichols, we currently have got approximately $10 billion in export trade from Australia, two-way trade sitting at $20 billion. So even without the agreement in place, there's significant trade happening with the UAE. Is it not beneficial for us to have some sort of framework to then try and have dialogue and shift potential ideology in a constructive way, rather than just have essentially a free-for-all?
I'll answer that if you like. Well, we do have substantial trade already with the UAE, and we've heard from several previous witnesses that there is going to be some increase, but it's not a huge increase in trade. But I guess I would go back to the fundamental point, which is the UAE does have the worst record on human rights and labour rights of any country that we've negotiated. And a lot of not only unions but civil society groups have wanted to make a point about this, that there should be some commitments, especially to basic rights. And 90% of the UAE workforce really have no rights at all because they're temporary migrant workers who can be deported if they raise any issues about their working conditions. So I think that, that's the fundamental point, rather than, measuring what the additional benefit will be. I guess we're, from the point of view of my network, we want to make the point to the committee that there are some fundamental principles involved, and that the government does have a policy on this, and that although these things are mentioned in the agreement, there are no firm commitments to improve the rights situation at all, and there's no way of enforcing those fairly weak commitments.
Mm-hmm. ACTU, have you got anything further to add?
Firstly, I just...
Yep.
Thank you. endorse what was also said and also include my previous answer to the question prior. The only thing I would add to it is to maybe reinforce the position that we do have strong two-way trade with the United Arab Emirates. As you point out, nearly $10 billion in two-way goods and services and two-way investment worth nearly $20 billion. It's our 19th largest trading partner. It's not clear to us that there are any discernible benefits that are coming from this, and that's why we have consistently called for trade agreements to be independently evaluated in terms of the economic benefits. And so, notwithstanding our first principle, which is that trade, preferential market access should be on the basis of shared human rights and workers' rights, that we are sceptical about the economic benefits that will flow from this agreement.
Yep, sorry, did I see your hand up, Mark? Did you want to add some comments? Or
I didn't have a hand up, but I would absolutely endorse the comments that have been made by the two other organisations on the panel. And we also accept that Australia has to maintain relationships, including trade relationships, with a whole range of states and of nations with different values, different human rights records. But again, to replicate what Mr. O'Brien said, we're talking here about preferential agreements, and those, we agree, should have a minimum standard at least of human rights and labour rights, which are met by our counterparty. And in this case, we would say that the UAE falls well below any possible standard that could be that Australia could hold another nation to. And so, yes, we agree with the comments that have been made on that basis by our friends here today as well.
Thank you for that. I guess the reason why I asked some of these questions is I sort of wanted to get to, because the wording or the mention of weak wording around, especially pertaining to Chapter 20, seems to be a common theme by the panel today. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts, whether you'd be more amenable to stronger wording that might firm up those commitments, and would that get a higher level of acceptance from the organisations of which you represent?
Thank you. I'm happy to kick off. So as we said in our opening statement, we believe the precondition for offering preferential market access is by ensuring that basic steps have been taken to safeguard workers' rights and human rights. So for us, that means ratification and implementation of fundamental principles and rights at work. So the core fundamental ILO conventions would be, in our opinion, a starting point. In addition to that, as you point out, whilst we note that it is positive that there is a labour chapter, the wording could be strengthened, but probably more importantly than that, the wording could be enforceable. I think what's notable in the labour chapter is how it excludes the dispute settlement provisions. So we could have all of the great words that we would want in said chapter. If they are unenforceable, then they really do not count for much. We think it's a positive step, and I want to acknowledge the government's efforts there, but we should note that these are unenforceable to start with.
Thank you.
Yes, I would comment that even the DFAT national interest assessment says very clearly that these chapters are not enforceable and the commitments are not binding. And that would certainly be something that we would expect to be in any trade agreement negotiated by this government. It's worth saying that in the negotiations for the Australia-EU trade agreement, it is being proposed that there be chapters which that is enforce, strong commitments on these issues, and that they be fully enforceable through the state-to-state dispute process in the agreement. So it is possible to have agreements like that. In fact, Australia's other agreements have been moving in that direction.
Thank you. I think that's it from me, Chair, at this stage.
Thank you. I've just wanted to just clarify, I guess, the positioning from your organisations. Traditionally, free trade agreements have really focused on trade, goods and services, as well as investment. That's sort of the textbook definition of a free trade agreement. This particular agreement that's before us has the inclusion of a few new chapters. We heard concerns from earlier witnesses about there being a chapter on animal welfare. As you've pointed out, there's a labour rights chapter and there's a chapter more broadly on women. Is this a new position of each of your organisations to outright oppose an agreement for human rights and social justice reasons? Is this a new position that you've of your organisations?
Happy to start and then hand to Patricia. This is not a new position from the Australian Union Movement. The Australian Union Movement has always held the view that preferential market access should be on the basis of shared values, protection and promotion of human rights and workers' rights. So this is something that is very core to our movement's beliefs and the way in which we believe trade should be conducted by Australia.
Yes, and I would add that if you look back over the 20 years of our history, we have always advocated for enforceable labour rights, human rights and environmental standards in trade agreements. And I think the China Free Trade Agreement was mentioned earlier, and we certainly criticised the human rights and labour rights in China and advocated for enforceable rights in that agreement as well. And we're doing it with every agreement.
Yeah. So if I can just sort of go back, so one of the agreements that we've had since 2010 that our country entered into is the ASEAN agreement. Some of the countries that are signatories to that, Brunei, Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, all still have bans on LGBTIQ. Tragically, and there's a lot of work there to do in terms of that social justice campaign. Do you recall if your organisations opposed this agreement back then on those grounds, on LGBTIQ grounds?
We certainly advocated for enforceable labour rights and human rights in that agreement, yes. But we're not saying any one of these particular rights, makes or breaks the agreement. What we're talking about is a suite of human rights and labour rights. And in the case of the UAE, I'm afraid they failed the test in all of these areas.
Would you also say existing countries that we have agreements with, like under the ASEAN agreement, where we've got a trade agreement in place, with countries like Myanmar, Burma, is that something that you believe that, is it all agreements that we now need to be really conscious of? Is this sort of a new direction that you're hoping that our country takes in relation to agreements, that we stop doing trade agreements or look at reviewing trade agreements that we currently have based upon what's going on domestically in countries?
Well, there is currently a review of the ASEAN trade agreement going on. In fact, there was a kind of partial review completed under the previous government, and we advocated, particularly in relation to since the coup happened in Myanmar, that Myanmar shouldn't be included in trade agreements. But in general, we have always advocated that all of these human rights and labour rights and environmental issues should be taken into consideration. I think the whole framework of trade agreements has moved over the last 20 years, so that now there are more trade agreements where these things do have chapters and are addressed in trade agreements. So the question becomes how, whether the commitments are actually real and whether they're enforceable. And we are certainly advocating in reviews of existing trade agreements that there be progress on these issues. We're not advocating that Australia should withdraw from these trade agreements at this stage. But in the case of a country like Myanmar, we did advocate that Myanmar not be included in trade agreements because of the military coup and the really dire situation there. It's really a civil war situation.
If I may, Chair, sorry, just to follow on from what AFDINET has just said, we also oppose the ASEAN trade agreement, including Myanmar, since the coup, and that's really for the reasons of that trade agreement would legitimise the military junta there, and so really, that is the reason why we don't think we should have entered into an agreement with Myanmar. But it's also the difference between a bilateral agreement and a plurilateral agreement, I think. So, in this case, we are doing a bilateral agreement with the UAE, and it is, the worst regime that Australia has entered into a bilateral agreement with. And I think it's also about whether there's a baseline on which we can have these dialogues. So in a country like the UAE, where independent unions are not even allowed to operate, it's really hard to see how, for instance, the dialogue that's proposed in the Labor chapter could be genuine. I think this is a case where we're going to see the UAE use this agreement as window dressing, as a process of kind of greenwashing and saying, look, we've got this great Labor chapter with the Australian government, we've been given the tick of approval. And I don't think we should allow our trade agreements to be used in that way. So thank you.
Can I just ask a question then? How do you see, if you believe that the chapters that have been negotiated aren't going to affect change or start to help support, create or social change, how do you see it happening in these countries? I'm not suggesting for one moment that the words that we have in our agreement will radically change a country, but my experience of tours, of study tours, of speaking, of supporting and encouraging civil society, having that dialogue or discussion between governments does help create an opportunity for change. Why do you believe that this won't be successful?
Well, we think that offering preferential market access should be on the basis of shared values, and we think it is encouraging the Australian government is having a dialogue with the United Arab Emirates. It should be using that dialogue to set out some preconditions upon which trade should occur, such as ratifying and implementing those fundamental ILO conventions that would, to your point, start to build civil society, start to ensure free trade unions were able to operate. Those are the basis upon which we should start discussions around a free trade agreement. It should not be something that is tacitly mentioned in the Labor chapter that is unenforceable. We think this is about setting preconditions with trading partners to ensure that they are on a pathway to enforceable human and labour rights.
I mean, the Australian employment market isn't always perfect. We know that there are, unfortunately, cases being prosecuted right now in Fair Work for cases which are akin to modern slavery. We are continuing to work towards ensuring that all workers in Australia have a safe workplace and are paid appropriately and treated with respect. Is there an opportunity under this agreement for us to make sure that we continue to improve our working conditions for Australian migrant workers?
So, sorry, go on, Patricia.
Well, I think that opportunity is always there and the obligations are mutual. But in the case of the UAE, civil society is not possible in the UAE because there is no freedom of association. So not are there only no unions, but there are no, it is not legal to form human rights groups or any of those sorts of civil society groups. I agree that it would be positive to, if some dialogue could be established. I also share the ACTU's concerns about how meaningful that would be, but I guess the test of this agreement is whether anything happens at all if the agreement goes ahead. The test will be whether anything happens at all in relation to these chapters in terms of dialogue leading to actual change.
Thank you. My final question before I see if any of the other committee members have some questions for you, it actually relates to something that we haven't covered yet. It's in relation to the impact this agreement will have on Australian industry and jobs. In previous agreements, there was a bit of a trade-off, and we heard quite a lot about that there'd be some winners and some losers in terms of Australian industry. And your members were incredibly vocal about the impact, say, the China Free Trade Agreement would have on local industry and jobs, or the Korean Free Trade Agreement would have on local industry and jobs. What jobs or industries could potentially lose out under this agreement, local industry and jobs? Can you identify any? Are there any potential industries at risk under this agreement?
I can take that one, Chair. Look, we haven't got any specific industries to call out, but I think this really goes to the broader point around the lack of economic modelling and analysis. And what we've long called for is that all trade agreements, before they're ratified, need to have a really rigorous analysis of the jobs impact, the social impact, the health impact, for instance, gender impacts. So we don't have that. So we simply do not know. Thank you.
And just further to that, I'll come back to our opening, which is that Australia has a proud record of workers' rights. We should be using our trade to advance and promote workers' rights. And so trade should not be a simple calculation about which jobs are created, which industries thrive or survive. It should be a question about Australia's values in the world.
I think it's worth adding here that the UAE does not have any significant manufacturing industry, which is the areas where most impacts have happened in the past.
Okay, so we heard earlier that there's an opportunity for jobs growth in sectors like agriculture, dairy, meat, everything from live exports all the way through to food processing and food, and particularly food manufacturing. They're big workplaces. You've got lots of members, affiliates in those workplaces. Do you know if they are, optimistic about the potential growth for their industry and jobs under this agreement?
It's not been an issue that's been raised with us in terms of economic benefits. As I said, the main concern that unions have is our obligations to workers throughout the world and the issues that I've raised in relation to workers in the UAE. That has been our primary concern with this agreement.
Okay, that's the last question that I had. I'm just going to go to see if we've got any other questions from any other committee members. It doesn't. Senator Cox, did you have some questions?
I did. I just wanted a clarifying point if I can.
Yep, go for it. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you all for appearing today. I think your message has been loud and clear in relation to the free trade agreements with the UAE. Can I just ask, Patricia, in your opening statement, you talked about the 9 organisations that had written to the Trade Minister. I'm just curious, was there a response from the Trade Minister in relation to the concerns that you raised?
Just trying to remember. Yes, we did get a response, but that was during the negotiations. So none of the things about the agreement were settled at that stage.
So none of them were addressed in what you've outlined, and they were consistent with what was raised by...
Well, negotiations were ongoing, so we got a response saying, thank you for your raising these concerns. The negotiations are ongoing. That's the usual response that you get when negotiations are ongoing and there hasn't been the agreement hasn't been finished and we haven't seen what the text is.
No.
It's only been since we've seen the text that we've known the detail of what's in the agreement.
Yeah, hence why you're all here. And thank you for your ongoing work and your commitment, particularly to labour and human rights across the important work we do in free trade agreements and brokering our international trade. Just one follow-up question. I think that your several comments across all three of our witnesses today have really talked about the lack of legally binding language that's being used across this agreement, and I think what was referred to as the precondition of that was heard particularly from the ACTU in that. Do you see that there is, and I think that this alludes to the Chair's questions around if any agreements in relation to the UAE are to move forward, what would you like to see is included in all of that? Like, where do you want that to start from? What is your starting point? I know that you talked about the preconditions, but is there an actual way forward now, I think, is the practical question in this.
We would say that the preconditions have not been met, and so our first step would be to say to the Australian government that the Australian government should communicate to the UAE that we would strongly encourage it to ratify, in particular, ILO fundamental conventions, that would start to set the preconditions in trade for consideration of preferential market access, i.e. a free trade agreement. But we'd want to see those conventions both ratified and implemented first, and then, absolutely, not only would we want to see stronger language in a labour chapter, but an enforceable labour chapter. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else wanted to make any further comment on that. No? That's great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, witnesses.
Great, thank you. I think that brings us to the end. I've just double-checked all the apps.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a supplementary question.
Absolutely. Member for Spence, go for it.
Senator Cox's question to Patricia, sorry. Just in relation to your letters or correspondence to the Minister, has there been a follow-up correspondence since the substantive wording with the proposed agreement to the Minister and subsequent response if that has occurred?
Well, we received the text of the agreement when everyone else did, and we've made our submission to this committee. So that's how we've followed up.
Okay. Thank you.
We have made public statements about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, thank you. That does bring us to the end of the questions, and thank you very much for your evidence that you've given today. This is the first of the hearings that we've had in relation to this free trade agreement. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request any corrections to transcript errors. Please send your responses to any questions taken on notice during this hearing to the Secretariat by close of business, the 7th of February 2025.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. We've now got our department, the fourth panel. We are a bit early, so we'll just see if we're able to get the representatives at the table so we can finish a bit earlier.
sure where your nameplate was. Oh, it's right there. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're good to go.
Okay, I think we're just waiting on one more witness to join us. Thank you so much, everybody, for being available to join us a bit earlier this afternoon.
Sorry, who are we waiting for?
The Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
They might be on.
What we might do is we might begin, and then when our final witness joins us, we'll introduce them at that stage. So given that we've got almost our entire committee here, which is excellent, and the rest of our witnesses, we'll begin. I'd now like to welcome representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Department of Industry, we'll get to them in a moment, Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and Australian Border Force to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you each please state your name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee, starting with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have a number of colleagues, as you can imagine, involved in the negotiations. What we might recommend in the interest of time is maybe the colleagues at the table introduce themselves, and also colleagues online from individual agencies. And then when we have colleagues who come to the table maybe to answer a question, they should make sure that for the Hansard record they introduce themselves. Is that acceptable to you, Madam Chair?
That is perfect. Thank you very much for your organisation.
Thank you very much. I think the proof will be in whether we answer the questions you have for us. Madam Chair, my name is Ravi Kevaram, and I head up the Free Trade Agreement and Stakeholder Engagement Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I have the privilege of having had the grand title of Chief Negotiator for this FTA.
Good afternoon. My name is Gemma Huggins. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Middle East branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Hello, my name is Jessica Allen. I'm Director of FTA Services and Deputy Chief Negotiator.
Hello, I'm Brett Hughes. I'm Director in the Trade and International Division of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
I believe we have colleagues from ABF online.
Yes, good afternoon everyone. Hello Madam Chair, Kimberly Clydesdale, Assistant Secretary for Customs and Trade Policy Branch within the ABF.
And I'm Cody Wilson, Acting Director, Trade and Tariff Policy, also within the ABF.
Madam Chair, then, as I mentioned, I have a range of colleagues from across DFAT, particularly in the room, and we will introduce as we speak, if that's all right.
Thank you. We've got a few more words to read before we get to your opening statement. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. Now I'd like to invite you to make an opening statement before we proceed to members' questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee as well for this opportunity to provide a brief opening statement to you on the Australia-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and the agreement between Australia and the United Arab Emirates on the promotion and protection of investments. On 6 November 2024, these two agreements and side letters were signed by His Excellency Senator Don Farrell, Minister for Trade and Tourism, and His Excellency Dr. Thani bin Ahmed Al Saudi, UAE Minister of State for Foreign Trade. We refer to those two agreements that I listed, the 5 binding side letters that were also signed, along with the 5 non-binding investment MOUs, as the CEPA package or the CEPA package. And the intention is that this package be considered as a whole and examined by you as a whole. And when we talk about CEPA, we include this grouping of collective outcomes and obligations. I'd like to highlight for you some of the key benefits for Australia from the CEPA package. First, it is our first free trade agreement in the Middle East region and is one of the most liberalised trade agreements the UAE has signed. When fully implemented, it will remove tariffs on 99% of Australia's exports to the UAE by value, giving Australian exporters to the UAE a significant edge over other international competitors. And I think you heard in some of the evidence or testimony provided earlier this afternoon, about the need to maintain a competitive position with our competing trading partners. The resulting tariff savings of the agreement to Australian exporters will be in the vicinity of $135 million in the first year, rising to $160 million when the agreement is fully implemented. Australian farmers and food and beverage producers will gain from preferential access to the UAE's growing market for premium food and agricultural produce. The Australian resources industry will gain a competitive advantage from elimination of tariffs on minerals, including alumina, Australia's largest export to the UAE. CEPA unlocks new opportunities and provides greater certainty for Australian service providers exporting to the UAE, including in sectors such as education, professional services and financial services, and makes it easier for certain skilled professionals to work temporarily in the UAE. It offers services businesses the assurance of high-quality rules to address what's called behind-the-border barriers to services trade, and includes digital trade rules that will benefit Australian businesses, workers and consumers. Investment is a major focus of the CEPA package, particularly as UAE sovereign wealth funds collectively manage over $1 trillion in assets. 4 of those sovereign wealth funds are in fact ranked in the world's top 15 in terms of size, sovereign wealth funds. CEPA puts in place high-level arrangements to facilitate UAE investment into Australia in priority sectors, including projects that support Australia's clean energy transition and future Made in Australia objectives. This includes, through a Council on Investment, making it easier to understand opportunities and navigate Australia's foreign investment framework. As well, through the provisions of the 5 associated non-binding investment MOUs on green and renewable energy, data centres and artificial intelligence projects, food and agriculture, minerals, and infrastructure development. Collectively, this agreement, this set of agreements, this package, and these MOUs send an important signal to UAE businesses and sovereign wealth funds about the value both countries attach to increasing two-way investment. That is why also investment protections for Australian businesses and non-discrimination provisions are included in the investment agreement for Australian investment into the UAE. CEPA contains very important First Nations outcomes. It is Australia's first FTA to include a chapter covering First Nations trade and investment with valuable outcomes for First Nations businesses. CEPA also includes a standalone chapter acknowledging the importance of a gender balance and women's economic empowerment, as well as a chapter on the environment and the transition to net zero. We have just heard, of course, a range of evidence, and we have seen submissions from a number of stakeholders with respect to labour issues in the UAE. This is an important policy area in which we engage closely with these stakeholders and also with the UAE in the negotiations. We negotiated a dedicated chapter covering trade and labour that includes outcomes the UAE has not previously committed to in any of its previous FTAs. In addition to promoting compliance with International Labour Organization standards and enforcement of labour laws, it establishes a dialogue on labour to advance labour rights, including through engaging with stakeholders, and it promotes cooperation on labour matters. CEPA also includes a commitment that both countries will continue to improve their level of animal welfare protection. Other provisions and chapters of CEPA cover a range of important areas for Australia, with provisions on digital trade, intellectual property, government procurement, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, transparency, anti-corruption and economic cooperation. In summary, CEPA is a comprehensive and modern FTA which delivers benefits across multiple sectors of the Australian economy and society. It is important, I believe, to highlight that in negotiating CEPA, we went through a comprehensive process of two-way stakeholder consultation and engagement that included formal submissions, briefings, and ad hoc engagement. In addition to government agencies and states and territories, DFAT identified and worked with close to 100 different stakeholder organizations across business and the community during the negotiation process. The views of stakeholders were highly valued and helped negotiators pursue the best deal we could in Australia's interests. And the NIA contains the list of the organizations and individuals that were consulted as part of the process. And of course, submissions to the consultation process, other than where they are commercial in confidence, are on the DFAT website. So one final thank you, Chair and committee members, is to the team across DFAT, across the Commonwealth, as represented here by a number of agencies, across states and territories, as I mentioned, the Australian Embassy in Abu Dhabi, our Consulate General in Dubai, a real team effort working closely with the stakeholders to deliver Australia's, if ratified, if approved by you, Australia's 19th FTA. Thank you again for the opportunity to present here today.
Thank you very much, and I know that a number of committee members have quite a large number, like a very, I guess, diverse range of questions that people are seeking to ask. Before I jump in, I was just going to go to the Deputy Chair just to see if he had any questions at this stage, or to the member for Nichols. Okay, we might jump first to the member for Spence.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for providing evidence today. I am interested to hear our previous witnesses that we before us spoke about the exclusion of the disputes process relating to the Labor Human Rights chapter. Can you just talk us through why that position was reached?
Certainly. First of all, let me just begin by noting that it is crystal clear in the agreement which chapters or provisions are subject to dispute settlement and are not, and that is a deliberate treaty drafting to make sure that it is very clear what is subject to dispute settlement or not. I think Madam Chair actually put the question earlier in the context of how, Madam Chair, forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you sort of described traditional FTAs as being, goods and services and investment, and then you talked about other chapters. So the modern Australian FTA template, for want of a better word, has evolved a fair bit from that, goods, services, and investment focus, and has moved on to a range of what are either called progressive chapters, or the trade and chapters, or cooperative chapters, etc. That is us. But it is not necessarily a practice that all of our trading partners carry out in the FTA space. And certainly for the UAE, there were a number of these chapters where they were very open to the content and the discussion, but they were not persuaded that these needed to be in an FTA, and they were willing to sort of take the journey with us on how we do FTAs, but it was a very very carefully negotiated outcome, and part of the negotiations was a willingness to take on the issue, put it in what is a legally binding treaty, but not to have that subject to dispute settlement. The focus of a range of those cooperation chapters is what I would call very practical-oriented interaction, rather than trying to make it a kind of, thou shalt do something, and if you don't, you will be penalized. And so there is an element of wanting to explore together, wanting to learn together, wanting to build together, and to do that without a sort of legally binding stick type approach. So that's the macro in the UAE context. And if I may just add another perspective on this, we have the evolution of Australian trade policy over, say, 41, 42 years since we put CER into place, is very much to include these cooperative chapters, as I say. But for a long time, we were very suspicious that these trade and chapters or provisions might be used as protectionist tools against us. And so it's quite an interesting moment, I guess, when you look back on our journey as a nation and the agreements we've negotiated on, under governments of multiple parties, multiple governments. There has been this real evolution, but it's not in all our instances on FTAs where we have these sorts of chapters that they are subject to legally binding either. It is a negotiated outcome, FTA by FTA.
Thank you for that in-depth response. I am interested. So what you're saying over the last 42 years and through the evolution, that there has been some of these cooperative chapters included in some of our FTAs, and they have helped shift the dialogue to stronger wording in future agreements or iterations of agreements. Is that a fair thing to say? And that this essentially forms a starting point with the relationship as far as a trade agreement with the UAE?
Correct. What I would just clarify is that I wasn't suggesting that a provision will lead to a changed provision in the future. What I was suggesting or submitting really is that a provision that enables that dialogue and conversation, that conversation leads to action and outcome and, the sort of things that we want to see and that partnership building.
Okay.
And in some instances, through reviews and all of that, it might lead to different text as well. But that's, an addition.
No, but you've got to be having dialogue to be able to shift the dial.
Start, yes.
Just my last question for now. So the national interest analysis highlights multiple industries that would benefit from ratifying CEPA. Are there any that will be negatively impacted?
Thank you for that question. Look, and I think Australian Industry Group actually put this very well. And, as a public servant, I can't use the same phrase, but given she did, I'll borrow from her. I think she said there's prizes for everyone. The nature of this economic relationship with the UAE is such that it is exceedingly complementary. And so the sorts of things that we produce or manufacture, grow, etc., are not necessarily ones that we're going to be in sort of head-to-head competition with. So what we have been able to ascertain is that there isn't that sort of kind of direct negative impact. I think the question is really how do we make sure that the opportunity is spread across the Australian community, and that's where the inclusive chapters, the cooperation chapters we were just talking about earlier, that's where they fit in, because that's where we have the real focus on First Nations, for example. That's where we have the focus on SMEs. That's where we have the focus on women's economic empowerment. So this agreement, probably fairly uniquely, given the economic profile, is one where we can focus on that question rather than sort of having anyone identify as sort of losing from the agreement.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your responses.
Thank you, Member for Spence, and my apologies to our other presenters today who have joined this panel. I just wanted to take a moment to see if the other departments or Australian Border Force also had an opening statement. Did representatives of Industry, Science and Resources wish to make an open statement, or Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries, or Australian Border Force?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nothing further from the Australian Border Force at this stage.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Nothing from Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, and great and excellent. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that before proceeding. We've now got some questions from Senator Canavan, who has joined us. Senator, you've got the call.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for appearing. I just wanted to go back to where we started today, if you may have been tuning in, around the animal welfare chapter in the agreement. There were some concerns raised from some agricultural representatives about that. Can I just start, though, by asking what does this chapter do? What are its benefits and why has it been included in the agreement?
Certainly, Senator. Thank you for your question. Just to note that the animal welfare provisions, as such, it's not a chapter. It's a Article 21.4 within what is the broader economic cooperation chapter, and that chapter covers a range of issues that may not be elsewhere covered in terms of cooperation. So that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that this is not, it is not unique in terms of having a reference to animal welfare. Our FTA with the UK, for example, has animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance chapter. Third thing to say is that it is very simply at its heart a cooperation and enabling of dialogue provision. The text asks each party to endeavour to ensure that our own animal welfare laws and regulations and policies are implemented, and where there's scope to improve. It does not, just to say that again, it does not affect the right of each party to establish its own policies and priorities for the protection of animal welfare and to adopt or modify its laws, regulations and policies. The operative heart of it, as I said, in the cooperation space is to strengthen and build on existing cooperation and information exchange in the field of animal welfare, including on issues relating to the treatment of farmed animals. And it is to also encourage, if parties wish, to work together in relevant international fora on areas of mutual interest. Some of from the testimony that I was able to hear before coming up here, I think there was a concern about not so much what is in this agreement, but what might happen in future agreements. I think that this is the point I was making, that this isn't a new concept for us to include in FTAs, and we would only ever include them to the extent that the provisions themselves in that agreement made sense. Some of the other comments I heard were also about awareness before and so on. This sort of came out, but just to note that of the consultation, in the consultation process, there were a number of Australians seeking for us to have something in the animal welfare space. And the one recommendation from industry that we are aware of in this space was that, and this was, I believe, from the Australian Live Exporters Council, was that CEPA should establish a mechanism for the UAE to raise any concerns with changes to Australian livestock regulations, and we got that outcome. So Article 21.4.3 says that at the request of either party, the parties shall meet to discuss any issue relating to animal welfare and any mutual cooperation. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Can I just ask, did the department, your department or any other departments or the government consult with the RSPCA or the World Animal Protection about those provisions?
I will just look up in the NIA, Senator, we have the list of those consulted. Sorry, you were asking about the RSPCA. So, yes.
Yep.
And what was the other one?
World Animal Protection.
I don't have World Animal Protection on my list, or it's not included in the list in the NIA. RSPCA, I do.
Okay. Thank you for that. There is on your website, on the DFAT website, there's a list of submissions received. One of those is from World Animal Protection, but you didn't follow them up with any consultation. Is that the difference?
Thank you, Senator. Well spotted. I will check that. But if there is a submission, there is a submission. But I am. It's not. It's not like
the consultation means that what consultation means actually talking to them or following up with them in some way.
In some.
Yeah. Okay. So we had evidence earlier that some of the agricultural groups weren't consulted about the animal welfare provisions. That it was a news and a shock to them when it came out. Was there any reason they weren't included in these discussions?
So the nature of how we ran the consultations was we would have a number of sort of general briefings to everyone who'd sort of expressed interest in the UAE negotiations, either through submission or through direct contact. Our records have that on the 14th of June 2024, we briefed a number of groups on the animal welfare sort of possibilities and where that would head. And several livestock and agriculture groups attended or were invited, including National Farmers Federation, MLA, and Dairy Australia. We're not aware of, in any specific, we're not aware of flowing from that any organisations that were present expressing a view or seeking further consultation.
Right. So you're saying that both the dairy industry and what was the other?
So the meeting on 14 June included NFF, MLA, Dairy Australia and Australian Live Export Council.
Oh, so ALEC as well. Yep, didn't miss that. But so you're saying at that meeting you raised the prospect of animal welfare being included in the UAE agreement.
And the reason for that was because on our website you will have noted that there were submissions seeking the provisions.
Okay, including the animal welfare provisions.
Including animal welfare provisions. And so I don't have the list of submissions on me, but there was, so I do now. Thank you very much. So we did get submissions from, I'm just trying to see who we got submissions from with respect to the actual issue of animal welfare. I imagine the RSPCA definitely. And I think, did you mention the submission on World Animal Protection from World Animal Protection as well?
Yeah. Submission.
Yeah, and so they were also of the view that there should be animal welfare provisions. So this was very much on, I guess, on the radar, if I can put it that way, and given the fact that it was also in a previous FTA, I'm not trying to profess that it was sort of, hours of discussion, but it was part of the discussion.
Well, we obviously have two different versions of events, so we might follow up with the early witnesses to see the situation there, ask them to have a look at the Hansard, but that's your evidence, so that's fine.
And Senator, sorry, if I may.
You can add to it. I'm just moving on though.
Okay, no, I just wanted to say to you that we have, the list I read out to you was attendance or invited, and what we will try and do if we have the technical records is to just, confirm who was actually there. So I'm not trying to be contrary to the evidence that was provided before. It was just that these were our records and recollections and the process that we ran.
Okay. Well, if you could provide that on notice, that'd be great. Just finally on this topic, wanted to ask who initiated the idea to have these articles about animal welfare? Was it at the Australian representative's request?
No, I'm pretty sure it would be us. It was us.
Okay, would have thought so. Yeah, thank you. And look, just one other topic I raised earlier. There's apparently some provisions about Indigenous or First Nations people, I think, is what is referred. What are they intending to do?
Okay, thank you for the question, Senator. So the First Nations chapter is something that is kind of really a very important symbol in of itself. I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to understate the importance of having a chapter like this in an FTA. It is, it is intended, again, it is meant to be very much of a cooperative nature. And what it is meant to do is to ensure that First Nations businesses and the opportunities for First Nation businesses are very much at the forefront of thinking about making sure that the inclusive nature of this FTA delivers on its promise. And so the idea is that we would look at how to make sure that First Nations businesses can benefit from the trade and investment outcomes achieved, which are for all Australian businesses. How do we share the experience to enhance the ability of First Nations people and businesses to participate and benefit from both parties' energy transition? How to develop links with First Nations people-owned businesses to make sure that they can fit into our supply chains, to facilitate cooperation between First Nations businesses on exporting or trying to enter into the UAE market.
Are there First Nations peoples in the UAE, or are you only referring to Australian First Nations people?
So it was a very interesting conversation that we had with the UAE when we were explaining, how it works in Australia, and of course, in the UAE, the First Nations people are the Emiratis. So there is, and they were. But they were very open to trying to, as I say, have these cooperative provisions to make sure that, our priorities with respect to First Nations inclusion in the overall Australian trade story, in the Australian prosperity story, is enabled. So they were very up for it, but it is aimed at making sure that Australian First Nation people are able to tap into the benefits of this agreement.
I just wanted to finish with kind of a statement, but you can respond. I suppose my concern here is when you start putting animal welfare, you mentioned this before, some energy transition points, now First Nations issues. I worry that trade agreements seem to be getting a little bloated when they really should just be about facilitating business. And people in business usually don't have a lot of time for this stuff because good business people are just worried about getting the products on time and serving their customers. And yes, normally that does help people like First Nations people if businesses are good, but it's not normally their number one priority. I'm just worried that trade agreements now seem to be becoming about the priorities of Canberra and the bureaucracy, and they'll give rise to lots of meetings between officials, but will they actually generate business, which is their primary concern? Is there anyone looking at this issue that the trade agreements seem to be getting bigger and bigger and actually less effective over time?
Senator, I'll take that as a comment and a question, if I may. And I think this comes back to some of the discussion that was being had earlier with respect to the trade and chapters. I think that the focus of these chapters, which haven't necessarily always been in previous FTAs, is to build on and to ensure the benefits are spread across everybody who could potentially trade. And so in the First Nations chapter, for example, in the Women's Economic Empowerment chapter, the focus is very much on how do we make sure sectors of the community who haven't always sort of benefited from trade are are being thought about, are being facilitated to the extent possible through things like possibly business missions and so on. But the heart of this deal remains the fact that 99% of Australian products, when the agreement is fully in force by value, will be duty-free. The fact that I think it's 120 service sectors and subsectors will be subject to disciplines into the UAE. The fact that government procurement opportunities are opened up to Australian businesses, etc. So there is no denying the trade and investment focus of the agreement. As I said, these additional chapters are designed to try and make sure that everybody across the Australian community can tap into that. Thanks, Senator.
Sorry, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Great. I'll just checking to see other committee members who may have questions. I've got a couple whilst we clarify that. Just picking up on that line of questioning, just the new chapters that have come into the agreement that do specifically relate to women's empowerment, labour rights, environmental standards and First Nations. Most of the conversation so far has been focused on sort of the other party to the agreement being compliant. Can I just check and clarify what's being proposed? Are we in Australia compliant with what's being proposed, or would there need to be further amendments to existing laws, legislation and policies to satisfy what's being proposed in this agreement?
Madam Chair, in the NIA itself, I believe, there is a list the amendments that will be required subsequent to, should this committee recommend ratification and should the government wish to proceed. And that includes, for example, the relevant customs legislation to make sure that we list the tariff lines and so on.
Oh, sorry, I'll clarify that. Like, that's granted that, a more traditional free trade agreement where there's a number of enabling legislation that's required around tariffs. I was more referring to the modern parts that have come into this. So the labour rights chapter, for example, are we as a country compliant with what we've proposed in the labour rights chapter?
Across the board, Madam Chair, yes. Everything that we have proposed, other than the things that need specific changes, are things we comply with.
And so therefore, any concerns that business may have that this would increase their compliance or costs is null and void because they already have to meet this standard?
Correct, Madam Chair. There is nothing in the UAE FTA that requires change to Australian legislation rules in these cooperative chapters. And furthermore, there is nothing in them that requires us to step back from our values as they relate to any of the subject matter of the agreement or more broadly.
If this agreement didn't have these chapters, or if this agreement didn't proceed, how does our nation have this dialogue with the UAE? Like, how do we currently have this dialogue, whether it be in relation to human rights, labour rights, women's economic empowerment, First Nations or environmental standards? How is this improving our opportunity to have that dialogue?
Madam Chair, I might ask my colleague, Ms. Huggins, to just briefly outline some of the things that we do currently, even outside of an FTA, but then I will come back to how, in my view, the FTA really turbocharges the opportunities that we have for that sort of engagement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would say that on all those issues you've mentioned, we've had an ongoing dialogue with the UAE on. We do it bilaterally, either through our ambassador in Abu Dhabi. We do it here in Canberra. We also do it in multilateral institutions. Some of the things that we engage on are around labour rights, human rights, women's rights. I would like to acknowledge, actually, in this hearing, the improvements the UAE has made in some of these sectors as well. In human rights, we have observed improvement and change across a number of areas, including women's economic empowerment, expanding personal freedoms. And when I say that, I mean things like progressive changes to laws on divorce, domestic violence, sexual harassment, suicide. These are the things that we continue to encourage the UAE on through those dialogues. We know that the UAE has established now a National Human Rights Institution in 2021, similar to our own sort of institutions around human rights, which we warmly welcomed and continue to seek updates on how that is functioning and what it does. On labour rights, we have had an ongoing dialogue around its recent efforts to strengthen labour rights, including around domestic and household workers. We talked to them about their employment law reforms, so things around preventing discrimination, bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace, And we also have a dialogue with them on efforts to dismantle the kafala system. We seek updates regularly on what they are doing. So, for example, they've made recent reforms to that, including making it illegal to confiscate a worker's passports. But we continue to engage them in all these on all these issues. Most recently, our ambassador to the UAE met with the Emirati Labour Minister to follow up on labour reforms. But I would say, Madam Chair, that this is a core part of our engagement with the UAE. And I think, adding to Mr Khurram's sort of comments earlier, it's through the process of the CEPA that we have, and it's been a couple of years, that it actually has lifted that engagement. So it's been a really useful process and I think provided a lot of inroads to the UAE system for us.
Thanks very much. Madam Chair, if I could then add further to Ms Huggins' comments, because I was listening very carefully, and of course we've considered very carefully the submissions and engagement. We've had a number of engagements with those who were present and presenting to you earlier. Look, the reality is this, right? The UAE is a sovereign nation. It's a proud nation. It is a modernizing and modern nation. It was made very clear to me that I should be very careful not to look like I was, providing any comments or commentary about the reforms that the UAE has made, etc., because the submissions have their own sources of information. So I don't want to get into the debate about where a particular standard is or isn't or whatever. As Ms Huggins mentioned, there have been a process of ongoing reforms. The reason that's driving some of this, of course, so it's not just 90% of the workforce, but I think it's something like 90% of the UAE population is non-Emirati. So the way that the UAE sees issues with respect to the labour force are very different to the way that we see issues relating to the labour force. There is a process of reform underway, and the reason for that is, of course, the UAE has a desire to be a global trading hub. It has a desire to be acknowledged as being a leading source for labour supplying countries. It has regular dialogues with labour supplying countries. It is very conscious of, therefore, making sure that its economic progress is sufficiently, in keeping with its approach on all of these issues. And this FTA, like any of Australia's FTAs, protects Australia's ability to apply our values to international trade. As I was saying earlier, none of Australia's applicable trade or investment mechanisms on issues like eliminating modern slavery are changed as a result of this FTA, right? This FTA, like any FTA, is about increasing Australia's prosperity through trade and investment, and the export growth that comes from having a market that, even if it's not widely protectionist now, to maintain our competitiveness with other markets, other competitors, we need to keep building on our existing relationship. But absolutely critically, this FTA does something unique for the UAE in establishing something like a dialogue on trade and labour. So, first of all, even the cut-through that we were able to achieve through this FTA process of acknowledging that these issues, which matter to the UAE, should be dealt with through a trade agreement. And I talked about our evolution. Well, the UAE is going through its own evolution on trying to figure out what these connections are. And one of the conversations I had with my colleagues on the UAE side was, look, we get what you're trying to do. We're just not sure why this has to be in a trade agreement. So I really do not want to lose sight of the value that having, these sorts of provisions and chapters in a binding international agreement. Yes, it's not legally like dispute settlement, but it's still a legal agreement between two sovereign nations. And that is really, I think, worth something if we want to be projecting our values. I will always back Australia's ability to persuade and to project our own values when we have a seat at the table. Ms. Huggins talked about the dialogues that we have or engagement that we have. We do not have a formal dialogue on labour, right? So it is part of this process of the FTA negotiations, which has really opened doors for us as a trusted partner that the UAE can go on its journey with on many of these issues. And if we don't have the FTA, we don't have that unique bilateral seat at the table.
Thank you. If I can go to some questions, I guess, of the more traditional nature of free trade agreements and that sort of impact that it will have on Australian industry and business. And we did hear from some of the industries that believe that they'll benefit under this agreement and the growth opportunities that they have. Australian dairy, Australian small goods, meat and live export. And there are a number of others that we'll hear from next week that also believe they'll benefit, particularly in the agriculture sector. Can you talk us through the job opportunities or potentials under this agreement? With previous agreements, it's always been talked about in terms of sort of job creation. So I was just wondering if you could step us through quickly the growth potential that we would have in relation to this agreement for Australian industry and jobs.
Look, thank you very much. So the released on the DFAT website is modelling about what's seen as the goods export increases anticipated out of the FTA, and that is in the order of $678 million annually across those sectors that you mentioned, and as you said, some others who will be appearing before you next week. But the other thing to mention also, of course, is that it's a growth story, and the jobs in those industries, but it's also ensuring continued prosperity of those enterprises story. And what I mean by that is, as you heard in the evidence from, I think, some of the meat industry colleagues, was that there are, we have competitor nations who are continuing their free trade journey as well. And so we need to make sure that we do not lose out even to that small tariff differential. And if you look at, for example, the outcome on wine, and I think that AIG was sort of talking about some of the culturally sensitive areas that may not see as much growth as you might expect in other sectors such as meat and dairy. But even there, for example, there are our major competitors into the market include from the Europeans. And we, with the tariff cut that we've got potentially through this FTA, we get a price advantage in that as well. And so, if you look across the sector, across the 99% by value of the goods that we currently export, I would say that there is opportunity and protection of opportunity across all of that. Now, that's goods. And what's harder to model, frankly, is the impact on services and the impact on issues like digital trade. And it's harder to model how much value the opening that we've achieved in the government procurement market will benefit. So I can't give you a job number, but I can say to you that Australian producers, Australian mining interests, Australian agricultural interests, Australian services interests, Australian universities, Australian professional services providers all stand to benefit from this agreement. And there is an enormous appetite, I'm not talking just food, but there is an enormous appetite for the Australian brand in the UAE. And what this FTA does is make sure that we can maintain price competitiveness, services regulatory discipline, and investment opportunities ahead of at least some of our competitors.
Okay, so just as a follow-up to that, one of the witnesses that we had said earlier that there's the analysis, the national interest analysis and the modelling that had been done couldn't really sort of point to any industries that might be exposed where there could be potential loss of business, loss of industry, loss of jobs. Has that analysis actually been done? And, I guess you might have already answered this earlier actually, like, is there any negative impact on Australian industry and jobs?
So in the national interest analysis, we actually look at sort of where there might be potential if one looked at, if you look purely at the macro level and kind of like, oh, we produce that, we're liberalizing that, etc., and therefore, but even there, the specifics of the things that we produce, for example, when it comes to car parts, the specifics of the things we produce and the specifics of the things that the UAE produces are not in head-to-head, contest. So, and it's not been raised with us about sort of a direct sort of negative adverse effect of anything like that. And the other thing is also there are already natural sort of price barriers, in terms of transportation costs and stuff like that, where the tariff isn't the main thing. That might be why the UAE, if it produced something, might not be exporting to us. They have huge markets on their doorstep. The costs of transport and so on enable them to sort of supply those markets, etc. So I'm always concerned about absolutes, but I can say that we are certainly not aware of negative adverse impacts on specific Australian industries.
Aware, or did the analysis and discovered there was no risk?
Well, I mean, the analysis. Sorry. Yeah, the analysis is sort of more macro, and so I guess I'm just being careful to kind of say no, never ever. There's not someone somewhere who might face a bit more competition etc. But in our process of consultation, in our examination of the macro level economy structures, in terms of the things we produce, the things they produce, I would say no. But as I say, I'm terrified someone will say, "Hang on, I produce, this and so on." But certainly we take great care in how we phase, in how we eliminate tariffs, etc., to make sure that any sort of adverse impacts that we might be aware of are definitely sort of worked through, including through thinking about whether there needs to be sort of adjustment or whatever.
Okay, that looks like it brings us to the end of our questions today. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance here today, and you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to any transcript errors. Please send through your responses to any questions taken on notice in this hearing to the Secretariat by close of business, the 7th of February 2025. I believe there were some questions from Senator Canavan. Just a couple of points of clarification. Yeah, great. Excellent. Well, thank you. And as you are the last witnesses for this hearing, I'd like to advise members that the our next scheduled meeting will be will be at 11 a.m. on the Monday, the 10th of February. That's the next private meeting. We are hoping to have another public hearing on this particular agreement on the 5th. We're just trying to confirm with witnesses who couldn't attend today if that date works for them. And on that note, I now declare this hearing closed. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you, ma'am.